Welcome back everybody to our lessons in jurisprudence. In this video what we're going to do is talk a little bit more about natural law theories, but we're going to do so through the lens of the medieval and the religious influences that came into natural law theories, of course in the early medieval period and sort of the high Middle Ages as well, when we talk about the work of St. Thomas Aquinas. We're going to divide this series into two lessons. We're going to focus on St. Augustine of Hippo in this lesson, and then we're going to talk about St. Thomas Aquinas in the next lesson. And the reflection of Augustine and Aquinas is almost very similar to the ways in which Plato and Aristotle understood and developed their natural law theories. And there's a good reason for this. One of the reasons is because when St. Augustine was writing, there was not the rediscovery of Aristotelian works and Aristotle's writings, which is obviously what influences Thomas Aquinas in a lot of ways, and we can see this Aquinian, or at least the Aristotelian influence in Aquinas' work in quite significant detail. So the traditions of the natural law would go about a radical shift and a major transformation, and in fact this influence is really hard for natural law even today to shake off in a lot of ways, because of the influence of newer religions, namely that of Christianity, and the development and growth and explosion of Catholicism and Catholic Christianity, Christianity more generally, in fact, owing to the fact that Christianity goes from being one of the most persecuted religions in all of Europe and the Mediterranean to the standard religion of the Roman Empire, and gets spread all across Europe, all the way up into Northern Europe, all the way across into Eastern Europe, and essentially becomes the major default religion in the Middle Ages. So, like I've said, it goes from being an outsider religious movement, it goes from being subject to persecution, to being the formal religion of the Roman Empire, spreading across the entirety of Europe and parts of Northern Africa, and continuing as the Northern Empire in the West, the Roman Empire in the West falls, and we get the establishment under Emperor Constantine of the Byzantine Empire, which is sort of described as the Eastern Roman Empire, which goes all the way up until the sort of mid 1400s. The most important of the philosophical and theological thinkers contributing to this were probably Augustine and Aquinas. Augustine is one of the most important of the early church fathers, and so too is Aquinas in terms of the sort of high Middle Age period. So we see here that, according to Wells, St. Augustine was an early church father living around the time of 354 to 430 AD. So in the very early periods, the early development of Christianity. And this is where Christianity was we see a bit of an interesting phase of Christianity in the very early periods, because ultimately Christianity is influenced very heavily by different theories and contributions to how to interpret biblical texts during this period. You get what are sort of known as heretical practices within Christianity, so things like Marcionism and Gnosticism. And then you get things like the formal codification of Christian doctrine and the formal codification of how theology is going to be interpreted and how Christian theology is going to be interpreted, with things like the Nicene Creed and the Council of Nicaea, for example, and various other councils such as the Council of Constantinople. Augustine himself was a theologian who operated in a place known as Hippo Regius, which is a part of Roman North Africa. Hence, he gets the name Saint Augustine of Hippo. And his writings on Christian doctrine provided some of the greatest influence to the works of theologians and church scholars who came after him. So, for example, we see here that he developed a number of ways in which we can interpret the biblical text. So, things like the doctrine of original sin and the doctrine of grace, which is linked quite significantly to the idea of original sin, are some of the elucidations about, and some of the elucidations about the Holy Trinity are things that were contributed by St. Augustine. So the idea of original sin in and of itself isn't a thing that is specifically cited in the biblical text. It isn't specifically cited in the book of Genesis, for example. Rather, it is something which is interpreted by St. Augustine as the idea of individuals and human beings having original sin as they are born, and they have to essentially repent through the concept of baptism, to the sacrament of baptism, to eventually become at one with Christ and with God. These are all ideas that came about and were ultimately adopted by the church and become part of the formal doctrines of church scholarship. So too was the conceptions about the Holy Trinity. Some of the major debates that takes place in this early period of Christian theology is about the concept of the Trinity, and it would be first adopted by the First Council of Constantinople in 381 AD. But of course, you're not here to learn about theology and the history of theology. You're here to learn about law and to learn about the philosophy of law. And so how does Augustine interpret his conception of the natural law? Well, I've already mentioned here is that the influence that is made and the distinction that we can make between Augustine and Aquinas on the basis of natural law theory relates to the influence of Aristotle. And I've written here in quite confusing language the influence that Aristotle had over both of them. Ultimately, Aristotle had no influence, or very, very little influence, over Augustine because Aristotle's works had yet to be rediscovered. But, of course, when we talk about Aquinas, you can see very much that Aristotle and Aristotelian concepts influence his theories. Not only his theory of natural law, but a lot of his other theological and philosophical theories as well. So when we think about how Augustine approaches the concept of law, we can see the theoretical conception of law, which is more akin to the ideas that we saw when we looked at Plato, in our Origins of Natural Law lesson. And one of the major similarities that we see here is the fact that Augustine, the way Augustine understands the human condition, he understands it as being a struggle between the concepts of good and the concepts of evil. And that ultimately submission to the will of God is the most optimal outcome for an individual to essentially operate. Now, this has been somewhat similar and can be somewhat similar to a Platonic understanding of a submission to a higher authority. He doesn't believe the higher authority is, of course, the Christian God, because Christianity didn't exist when Plato was writing, but instead he thought it to be more the idea of submission to a higher authority, the higher authority of the philosopher king, and the submission to the philosopher king. And so in reality, Augustine takes his theory of law to a far more extreme than that of Plato. So the idea of submission to God being the most optimal outcome is something that is quite interestingly applied, and we can make this clear connection between Augustine and Plato in this regard. But when we look at Augustine, he takes it to a far higher extreme, because according to Augustine, the law which is of the highest authority is the law which is derived from God. He calls this the lex eterna, or the eternal law. And so all other law, i.e. the regulations which form the positive law created by man, i.e. law that we are going to be studying, that we study at university, for example, is of no need unless one does not submit to the eternal law. So if you submit to the eternal law, then you have no need to even follow or even think about the positive law which is created by man. And as such, the concept of the lex temporalis which is sometimes described as the concept of the positive law, is of very little importance to anyone, so long as they subject themselves to the eternal law which is derived out of God. So it is suggested by Augustine, for example, in one of his famous writings, this particular Latin phrase, which I'm not going to try and read out because simply I'm going to translate it. It directly translates to mean that the idea of an unjust law is not law. Now, this is a very famous quote that is attributed to a lot of natural law scholarship. The idea being that when we think about the ontology of law, when we think about the actual existence of law itself, when we think about what law actually is and whether or not something is or isn't law, when we think about this in reference to natural law, the natural law scholar will tell you that what is and what isn't law refers to and directly is attributable to the idea of the nature of conferring to the concept of the natural rights, the natural morality, the concept of natural law as a moral principle. So they believe that there is an objective standard of morality that exists, and this objective standard of morality can be outlined in the natural law, and if a positive law, if a law that is created by Parliament or the courts, for example, does not adhere to the natural law, then it isn't law. The only law that is law in that sense is law which is attributable to the natural law, okay? And that's where we get this phrase from. We get this from Augustine. Now, the reason why this phrase is interesting is because what Augustine was arguing here was that the rules found in the positive law are only just, they are only law themselves, if they are also found and they are coherent with the eternal law, the law of God. So as a result of this, there can be nothing found in the positive law which hasn't been derived from the eternal law, okay? Which is why Augustine argues that if you submit yourself simply to the eternal law, then there is no need to even consider the positive law as having much of an impact in your life. And so as a result of which, we are signifying here the importance that Augustine places on the role of the eternal law in conjunction to and contrasting that to the concept of the positive law. In the previous lesson, we explored the ways in which the early church father, St. Augustine, developed this idea of natural law. And we see that we have the natural law theories that begin to come out of the ancient writings of Plato and Aristotle, develop and almost become Christianized by the theologians of the early medieval period. This lesson is going to talk about arguably the most famous of the natural law theorists, and this takes us from the early medieval period to more of the high Middle Ages, looking at the work of St. Thomas Aquinas, and looking at how St. Thomas Aquinas is influential in the development of a theory of natural law. So like I said, the previous lesson explored the works of the natural law theory from great Christian church fathers, the main one being, of course, that of St. Augustine of Hippo. We noted that Augustine's theory of natural law essentially situated the concept of God being the creator of something known as the eternal law, and this was representative of a higher law than that of the positive law which was created by man. And so that's how we get an understanding of what Augustine believed in regards to an understanding of the relationship between the positive law and the eternal law, the idea of law that was developed and handed down by God, the law from God, and how essentially the positive law is ultimately subordinate to this eternal law, this higher authority. This lesson is going to examine, like I've mentioned, the influences of Aristotle to the theory of natural law, as well as the ways in which this influenced specifically the writings of the more high Middle Age period from the works of St. Thomas Aquinas. So Aquinas was influenced by Aristotle in a number of different ways. So not only within his theory of natural law, but you also have within his theory of, for example, arguments for the existence of God in Summa Theologica. We see a number of different arguments for the existence of God described as, quote, cosmological arguments, which ultimately have a lot of influence from that of Aristotle and the Aristotelian conception of the prime mover. But that's philosophy of religion. We're talking about jurisprudence. So let's think about St. Thomas Aquinas in a little bit more detail. He was an Italian priest, as well as an influential philosopher, and as well as an influential theologian. He lived between 1225 to 1227. That's when he was roughly around when he was born. We do not have an exact date on that matter, but he died in 1274 and was a major proponent of the movement which became known as scholasticism. Now, his best known work was an unfinished piece of writing known as Summa Theologica, and Summa Theologica does a number of different things, including outlining arguments for the existence of God. We also find a number of his writings pertaining to a theory of natural law and other kinds of theological and philosophical conceptions. So Summa Theologica is a huge piece of writing, by the way. It is quite a hefty set of works, hence why it is unfinished. So he was not able to complete it before he dies. But then specifically when we think about how Thomas Aquinas influences natural law, we will see that the natural law theory of Thomas Aquinas will differ significantly from that of Augustine. And the reason why this is the case, or it is at least argued why it is the case, is because Aquinas would be heavily influenced by the rediscovered works of Aristotle. So while Augustine was writing in the very early Middle Ages, the early medieval period, we note that he did not have access to these old Aristotelian works because, of course, they had not been rediscovered. It was only when Aquinas was writing in around the 1200s that we see that we have these Aristotelian works that had been rediscovered. And the Aristotelian works that had been rediscovered led to ultimately a wave of intellectual conceptions and intellectual ideas from numerous different philosophers and theologians about the concepts that Aristotle taught about. So Aristotle would influence all of these individuals, and he would influence quite significantly the works of Thomas Aquinas. We can see this in the general ways that Thomas Aquinas views and understands the positive law. We can see some of the hints and influences of Aristotle there. So, for example, he argues that the positive law, don't forget the positive law is the law created by mankind, and we delineate this from the eternal law, which is the law created by God, within this kind of theological conception of natural law. He argues that the positive law plays a natural role in political and social life, rather than being simply something which is concerned with the application of commitments to sin, or commitments of sin, which is something that Augustine believed. So Augustine believed that ultimately the positive law was subordinate to that of the eternal law, in such a way that following and adherence to the eternal law, according to Augustine, would mean that the positive law to you had no relevance. And so the result of which is that there is a completely different conception of the way in which law is understood according to Aquinas versus that of Augustine. Aquinas' classical theory of natural law subscribes to something known as the overlap thesis. And what the overlap thesis essentially tells us is that there is some kind of non-conventional relationship that is had between the ideas relating to law and the ideas relating to morality. So a lot of ink has been spent over the hundreds of years, even thousands of years, describing the relationship, the interrelationship between law and morality. Aquinas throws his hat into the debate by talking about this idea of overlap thesis, the idea that there is some kind of non-conventional relationship that exists between the way in which law is and is applied, the nature of law, even the ontology of law, i.e. what law is, what it means to call something law, and the idea of morality. As such, one cannot understand law without some reference to the idea of morality. You cannot escape talking about law from a philosophical perspective, from a jurisprudential perspective, without examination of morality. And having a good, strong foundation of ethical theory is important for a good, solid foundation of your theory of law. Aquinas argues that all human and positive laws which exist ought to be judged by their conformity to the natural law. So what I should remember, and what I should at least highlight to everybody who is watching, is that when we talk about natural law, it is not just a jurisprudential theory. It is not just a theory of law or a theory of the philosophy of law that is limited to law students. Natural law is an ethical theory. It is a theological conception as well. And so as a result of which, you have to view and understand the natural law in that context. So with all this being said, the question that you would want to know the answer to, and the question that is asked throughout this series of lessons, is the ontological question, ultimately, the question of what actually it means to call something law. What is the existence of law itself? And according to Aquinas, the idea of an unjust law is something which only has the appearance of being law. So it has the idea of it being perceived to be law, but that does not necessarily mean that it is law in and of itself. An unjust law in and of itself is not a law, according to Thomas Aquinas. The reason for this is because for him, all law has to adhere to what he describes as the natural law. And what he describes as the natural law is what he describes as just. So, for example, if he says that something does not ascribe to the natural law, then he would argue that it is unjust, therefore it is not law. That is his conception. And so when we ask these ontological questions about the nature of law and what it actually means to suggest that something is a law itself, Aquinas argues that this judgment ought to be made in reference to adherence to this idea of the natural law. In addition to this, Aquinas notes that there exist two foundations from which ultimate reason and the ability to follow the correct course of action can be found. He believes in this idea of the lex divina, the lex divina, and he believes in this idea of the lex naturalis. Essentially, these represent, firstly, the divine law, the lex divina, applicable from biblical revelation. So talking about the revelation from the Bible, essentially, God as revealed through biblical texts, and the natural law, which derives out of rational human observation. These are the two ways in which he understands the foundations for which reason and the ability to follow the natural law can be found. From this, the lex humana, which is sometimes described as the human law, the positive law, is good if it rests upon the foundations of these two further ultimate reasons and foundations for defining what the natural law ultimately is. So long as you have the foundations of the lex divina and the lex naturalis, and you essentially apply the human law, the positive law, to those ultimate conceptions, then you have a good foundation from which law can be described. According to Makubury and White, for Aquinas, very clearly a provision of positive law which facilitates or serves a teleological good purpose will be binding upon the consciences of those to whom it is addressed, irrespective of their enforcement by agencies of the state. This is one of the things that I want to finish on, essentially, because we have this idea of teleology within Aquinas' conception of law. And this links very much to the conceptions of teleology that have been described by Aristotle. The link between Aquinas and Aristotle here is particularly strong, because from what we remember from when Aristotle was talking about natural law, we remember that ultimately what Aristotle believed is this idea of teleology of all things, and teleology refers to the idea of a telos, which just means end, and the end purpose, the end result of a particular action or a particular state. And ultimately it gives the view that people will not commit acts which violate the positive law, not because of their fear of punishment and some kind of deterrence, but rather because they are moral and rational creatures and recognize the immorality of the act. So you will not break or violate the law because you are scared of the consequences and the punishment acts as a deterrence. Rather, you will not violate the law because you are a moral creature, and to do so would violate the moral law, the natural law itself.